Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift through one of history's oldest patterns, the rise and fall of empires. We will move through rivers and fortresses, treasuries and battlefields, long roads and crowded ports, and the quiet rooms where rulers once believed their power might last forever. This is a story of conquest and order, of discipline and ambition, of wealth gathered slowly and lost the same way. Empires often seem enormous when we look at them from inside their own age. Their banners fill the horizon. Their soldiers march in steady rhythm. Their capitals glitter with stone, law, and confidence. But history is rarely still. Power rises, stretches outward, and then almost always begins to thin. Long before an empire becomes grand, it is only a small center of strength among rivals. A tribe settles near good land. A kingdom secures a river crossing. A city walls itself against attack. In the beginning, there is only pressure, scarcity, danger, and the need to organize better than those nearby. This is where empire begins, not in marble, but in urgency, again and again. Power gathered where people could feed armies, store grain, and move information. Fertile land mattered, iron mattered, horses mattered, roads mattered, but above all, coordination mattered. An empire was never just land. It was a system for concentrating force. That force was often military before it was administrative. Spears and shields came before tax codes. Cavalry often arrived before stable bureaucracy. A people that could fight together, endure losses, and obey command held an advantage over neighbors who were divided or less prepared. Victory brought tribute. Tribute bought weapons. Weapons secured more territory. The circle began to turn. Yet conquest alone could not sustain rule for long. An empire had to become more than an army on campaign. It needed scribes, storehouses, laws, roads, and officials who could turn battlefield success into durable control. The most formidable empires understood this. They were not merely violent, they were organized. And still, even at the height of strength, the seeds of decline were often being planted. Success changes a society. Wealth softens hardship. Elites grow comfortable, rivals learn, debts accumulate, provinces resent the center. Armies that once fought with hunger begin to defend abundance. Tonight, we begin at the opening of that great cycle, not with the fall and not yet with the golden age, but with the question beneath them both. Why do some peoples rise high enough to command others at all? The world slows, and so do we. As the night settles around you, imagine the first watchfires on a frontier, the first stone walls catching moonlight, the first disciplined ranks gathering beyond a riverbank. Somewhere in that stillness, power is beginning to organize itself. And from that quiet beginning, history will move. Beyond the first walls and watchfires, the next advantage was rarely courage alone. Many peoples were brave, many could fight, and many wished to survive. What separated a rising power from its neighbors was its ability to bind land, food, labor, and obedience into one steady structure. Early states formed where geography offered leverage. Rivers watered fields and carried grain. Plains allowed carts, cavalry, and movement. Hills offered defense, and coasts opened trade. In such places, a village could become a market town, a city, and a city, if it learned to command the countryside, the center of something much larger. Agriculture changed the rhythm of power. Once a society could produce reliable surpluses, it could feed not only farmers, but also soldiers, officials, craftsmen, priests, and rulers. Grain stored in quiet rooms became future campaigns. Irrigation canals, though humble in appearance, often mattered as much as weapons, because predictable harvests made organized states possible. From there came record-keeping, and from record-keeping came control. Someone counted sacks of barley, measured fields, noted debts, and tracked labor. A ruler who could count resources accurately could also plan better than rivals. The first empires were not built only by the sword, but by the patient habit of administration, by knowing what was owned, who owed tribute, and how many men could be summoned when danger approached. Metalwork and animals widened the gap. Bronze and then iron made tools and weapons harder and more numerous. Horses changed distance itself. Chariots first, and later cavalry, allowed power to move quickly across open ground. A state that could equip fighters, breed animals, and maintain supplies could strike farther than a neighboring people still tied to foot travel and local defense. Yet, material advantage alone was never enough. A rising state also needed hierarchy. Orders had to travel downward and loyalty upward. That did not mean every empire was peaceful inside. Many were harsh, unequal, and held together by fear as much as trust. But even fear, when systematized, could create an obedience strong enough to outmatch looser rivals. This is why so many early powers grew beside rivers and crossroads. Egypt along the Nile, kingdoms in Mesopotamia, dynasties in northern China, and states around the Mediterranean all reveal the same broad truth. Geography did not decide everything, but it offered certain peoples a stage on which discipline could scale. Once a people could store food, coordinate labor, move fighters, and compel tribute, a quiet transformation began. A border outpost here, a defeated rival there, a fortified road, a tax collector, a garrison near the crossing. Then the center expanded. The tribe became a kingdom, the kingdom a state, and the state began to imagine that its order deserved to reach farther than the horizon. Once a state had learned to gather strength, it faced the next test of empire, projecting that strength outward. Holding one valley was difficult enough. Crossing mountains, rivers, deserts, or seas to impose order on strangers required something more disciplined than bravery. It required a machine. That machine was built from ordinary things assembled with unusual consistency. Spears had to be forged, shields repaired, horses fed, wagons loaded, roads cleared, and messages carried. Behind every famous victory stood a quieter procession of laborers, armorers, engineers, quartermasters, and animals moving through dust and rain. Even the boldest charge depended on grain arriving when it was needed. This is why logistics so often separated expanding empires from fading rivals. A ruler might inspire men for a day, but only an organized system could keep them in the field for months. Rome understood this. So did the Persians, the Mongols, and the Ottomans. They built roads, relay networks, depots, and fleets as the hidden bones of expansion. Discipline turned these systems into force. A formation that could hold under pressure was more valuable than a larger crowd with weaker cohesion. Infantry drilled until movement became instinct. Cavalry learned when to harass, flank, and withdraw. Archers, engineers, and siege crews each had their place. On the battlefield, empire often looked sudden, but its sharpness came from repetition. Fortifications mattered too, not only for defense but for momentum. A captured stronghold became a base for the next advance. A chain of forts along a frontier allowed patrols, taxation, and the movement of supplies. Walls could slow an enemy, but they could also anchor a growing state, giving shape to borders that had once been only contested ground. At sea, the same logic applied. Shipbuilding, navigation, and port control allowed power to leap across water. Fleets did more than win battles. They escorted trade, carried troops, protected coasts, and made distant provinces think twice before rebelling. For maritime empires, disciplined crews were as decisive as cavalry had been on land. Then there was siege warfare, that patient contest between stone and persistence. Many cities could survive a raid, but far fewer could endure a sustained encirclement. Engineers raised towers, dug trenches, diverted water, battered gates, and waited. Siege warfare taught a lesson empires learned early. Lasting power belongs not merely to the force that strikes hard, but to the one that can remain. The empire on the march was never just a mass of armed men. It was a coordinated system of metal, food, roads, animals, discipline, engineering, and information. Where that system functioned well, borders moved. Where it broke, even powers could dissolve into panic. The banner at the front drew the eye, but the true engine of empire traveled behind it, axle by axle, mile after mile. But an empire is not carried by logistics alone. Beneath the roads, depots, and weapons lies something harder to weigh and easier to miss: the inner psychology of a rising power. Before a civilization believes it can rule others, it must first believe deeply in itself. Rising societies often carry a certain hunger. They remember scarcity more vividly than comfort. Their elites have not yet settled into luxury. There is usually a sense that history has not yet given them what they deserve. That feeling can be dangerous, but it can also be powerful. In these early phases, discipline often feels moral as well as practical. Service is praised. Endurance is admired. Wealth, if it exists, is expected to justify itself through contribution to the state. Families accept sacrifice because expansion promises land, honor, security, or reward. The empire is still a project. This is one reason rising powers can appear so formidable to older rivals. They are not always richer and not always more advanced, but they are often more concentrated. Their people may tolerate discomfort longer. Their officers may still be promoted for competence rather than pedigree. Hunger sharpens attention. Belief plays its part as well. Empires rarely march on economics alone. They march with stories. Some believe they are chosen by the gods, others that they carry a superior law, a truer faith, a civilizing mission, or a destiny written into the order of the world. These convictions can justify expansion, stiffen morale, and turn conquest into something that feels larger than ambition. Even fear can unify. A people surrounded by rivals or instability may accept stronger command because the alternative seems worse. Threats from outside often help create cohesion within. The army becomes not merely an instrument of conquest, but a symbol of survival. To serve it is to belong. This psychology shapes institutions. A rising power trains its young in habits that support expansion. It rewards reliability, toughness, and loyalty. It celebrates founders, victories, and moments of endurance. Hardship is remembered as proof of virtue, success as evidence of national character. Yet confidence contains the outline of future danger. The beliefs that fuel expansion can harden into arrogance. A state that once learned eagerly may later begin to lecture. A people that once feared decline may start to assume permanence. Still, that comes later. For now, we remain in the age of ascent, when confidence is still joined to effort. The camps are austere, the command structures sharp, the ambitions clear. Men sleep in armor near unsettled frontiers. Officers study maps by low firelight. Messengers ride through darkness, carrying orders toward the edge of known territory. A civilization is beginning to feel that it can do more than endure. It can advance, compel, and reshape the world around it. Sooner or later, a rising power must test itself in contest. Training, discipline, supply, and belief all gather toward this moment. The first victories of an empire matter because they change what a state thinks is possible. At first, these victories may be small. A neighboring tribe is subdued. A rival city loses near a river crossing. A rebellious frontier is crushed and fortified. Yet small victories can have enormous consequences. Momentum grows. Success attracts allies, tribute, recruits, and confidence. A state that wins repeatedly begins to look larger than it really is. News travels ahead of the army. Towns surrender sooner. Tributary rulers calculate differently. Merchants shift their loyalties. Local elites decide that resistance may be noble, but accommodation is safer. In this way, military success expands beyond the battlefield. It reshapes imagination. Many empires experienced such moments. Rome did not begin as ruler of the Mediterranean. It fought neighboring peoples for survival, then for advantage, and only later for mastery. The Mongols began on the steppe, where mobility and discipline allowed them to break settled kingdoms that had once seemed untouchable. The Ottomans expanded from a frontier principality into a force that absorbed cities, trade routes, and prestige. In each case, early victory showed that power grows faster once others begin to believe in it. These campaigns were exhausting and cruel. Armies marched through mud, hunger, heat, and fear. Men waited sleepless before battle, listening for movement in darkness. Commanders worried over terrain, timing, morale, and weather. A single mistake at the wrong bridge or pass could undo years of preparation. Still, victory has a strange power to simplify memory. Later, ages remember banners advancing and capitals falling, but not always the confusion beforehand. They forget how fragile these moments once felt. The empire that seems inevitable in retrospect was often one defeat away from remaining small. Once the first victories accumulate, however, the center begins to harden. Conquered land pays tribute. Captured roads extend reach. Garrisons secure crossings and ports. Wealth flows inward. The army grows more experienced, the treasury more capable, the rulers ambitious. What began as defense becomes expansion, and expansion begins to look like destiny. This is the stage when empire acquires its first aura. It is no longer merely surviving among rivals. It is selecting which rival to defeat next. The map is no longer something to fear, but to revise. And so the cycle turns clearer now. A power that once guarded own borders begins stepping beyond them with confidence. Conquest brings revenue. Revenue strengthens armies. Armies win more conquests, and each success persuades more of the world to yield before the next blow falls. The first victories do not complete an empire. They teach it to imagine one. With the first victories secured, conquest began to change its meaning. Land was no longer only ground to defend or cross, but a source of grain, silver, timber, horses, tolls, and taxes, each one feeding the state that had learned how to take and hold it. This was one of empire's oldest discoveries. The sword could open the way, but wealth had to follow if expansion was to continue. A triumph that produced no revenue soon became a burden, while a conquered valley that yielded crops, tribute, and recruits became the quiet engine of the next campaign. Great powers understood this clearly. Rome drew tax and manpower from provinces. Persia linked tribute to satrapies and roads. And maritime empires reached for ports because a harbor could collect customs, host fleets, and steer commerce as surely as a fortress could command a pass. Trade routes became almost as valuable as victories. Whoever controlled a river crossing, a narrow sea, or a caravan road could gather wealth not merely through plunder, but through repetition, through thousands of ordinary exchanges that slowly enriched the center. This is why empires so often reached for coasts, fertile plains, and mines. A ruler could not fund armies from glory alone. Armor needed metal, soldiers needed pay, cavalry needed pasture, ships needed timber, and garrisons needed bread every season, not just after a famous battle. Conquest, then, became more system than spectacle. The army took a city, engineers repaired the walls, officials counted fields, scribes assessed obligations, merchants reopened roads, and soon the defeated territory was being folded into the financial life of the victor. Some of this was brutal, and it should be remembered as such. Tribute was rarely voluntary. Taxes could be crushing, and captured populations often paid dearly for becoming part of a larger order. But for the empire itself, the process created a reinforcing cycle. Force brought wealth, wealth maintained force, and together they widened the reach of power. Even coinage played its role. A trusted currency could travel more easily than wagons of grain, and once an empire's money was accepted across provinces and ports, it gained another subtle weapon, because every market that settled in its currency tied daily life a little more closely to the center. Loot vanished quickly. Taxation endured. A captured treasury might pay for one season. A governed province could pay for generations. By now, the rising power no longer seemed like a temporary force born of one fierce generation. It was becoming a structure that could feed itself, arm itself, and imagine expansion not as risk, but as normal motion. That is when conquest deepens into rule, and when the empire, having learned how to extract wealth from distance, begins preparing for something harder still, the patient work of imposing order on what it has taken. Taking territory was only the beginning. The harder task was turning conquest into obedience that lasted after the army had marched on, after the smoke had cleared, and after fear had settled into routine. Empires that failed at this remained raiders. Empires that succeeded became systems. Order began with roads. Roads carried soldiers, but they also carried messages, judges, merchants, engineers, and taxes back to the capital. A paved road, a maintained bridge, or a guarded pass did more than connect places. It shortened the time between command and response. And in imperial history, that often meant the difference between authority and rebellion. Then came administration, that quieter companion to force. Governors were appointed, censuses taken, boundaries marked, storehouses filled, and local elites drawn into the new order whenever possible. A durable empire did not try to rule every distant village by direct command alone. It learned when to coerce, when to bargain, and when to let local customs survive beneath the wider structure of imperial law. The Romans offered roads, law, and citizenship to some. The Persians often governed through satraps and tolerated difference so long as tribute flowed and loyalty held. Law mattered because it made power predictable. A merchant will endure taxation more readily than chaos, and a province may accept distant rulers if contracts are enforced, banditry reduced, and dispute settled with some consistency. This was one of empire's great bargains, though never an equal one. The center demanded submission, revenue, and military service, but in return it often offered roads, markets, and a larger peace than smaller rival states could maintain on their own. Yet order was never self-sustaining. Garrisons had to be paid, magistrates supervised, corrupt officials punished, and ambitious generals watched carefully. So power had to be layered. Forts anchored provinces, tax flows fed armies, messengers linked capitals to frontiers, governors linked local life to imperial policy. This effort rarely felt gentle to those being absorbed. Rebellion, forced tribute, confiscation, and punishment remained close at hand. But if order held long enough, even conquered territories could begin to reshape themselves around the empire's rhythms. Markets adjusted. Children learned the new language of law. Roads reoriented travel. Armies recruited locally. What had once been foreign occupation slowly became daily structure. That was the real achievement of durable empires. Not simply that they could win battles, but that they could make millions of people wake daily inside an order first imposed by force and eventually maintained by habit, incentives, and fear. Now, the empire was no longer only expanding, it was learning to endure. And with endurance came prestige, the sense that this order, having lasted, might continue far longer than most subjects could imagine. When order holds for long enough, empire begins to glow. Roads are secure, tribute arrives, merchants travel safely, and the capital fills with the visible signs of success. Stone, ceremony, monuments, coin, and confidence. This is the age later generations call a golden age. Looking backward, it can seem almost serene. But golden ages are built on earlier struggle, institutions, taxed provinces, and armies stationed far from home. They rest on the belief that the center has discovered a superior way of organizing the world. At this stage, prestige deepens into something more than fear. Foreign envoys arrive with gifts. Neighboring rulers weigh alliances carefully. Subjects begin to assume that the empire's order is simply the natural order of things. Its architecture teaches permanence. Its ceremonies teach hierarchy. Its currency teaches trust. Rome projected this through roads, aqueducts, law, and legions. Britain did it through naval reach, finance, industrial strength, and a network of ports. Different empires used different tools, but the feeling at the center was often similar. This power appears secure because it seems to stand everywhere at once. A golden age also changes how an empire sees itself. Hardship retreats into memory. Founders become legends. The discipline that built the state is still praised, but fewer people remember its original severity. Children are born into order rather than struggle. For them, the roads have always been open, the army has always been present, and the frontier feels very far away. This can produce genuine achievement. Great powers at their peak often fund scholarship, engineering, urban life, maritime exchange, and ambitious architecture because they finally possess the resources to do more than survive. Yet, this is also the moment when illusion begins to gather around strength. Success is real, but so is the temptation to mistake a temporary advantage for destiny. A trusted currency may start to feel unshakable. Elites who inherited order may assume that order renews itself. From within the Golden Age, decline is almost impossible to imagine. The frontier is guarded, treasuries function, and the center is rich enough to believe it can absorb any shock. But history rarely warns loudly at first. The earliest signs of strain are usually faint. A heavier tax burden here, a slower response there, a provincial grievance ignored, a rival power studying carefully from the edges. For now, the empire remains radiant in its own eyes. Lantern light glows against polished stone. Standards hang above disciplined streets. Officials move through a world that seems ordered and secure. This is the dream of imperial maturity, not merely to dominate, but to appear lasting. And once a power begins to believe fully in that appearance, it steps into the most seductive part of the cycle, where supremacy feels least fragile just before it begins to change. At the height of empire, military power acquires an aura beyond the battlefield. It is not only the army itself that seems formidable, but the impression that resistance is futile, that the center can strike where it wishes, and that its methods cannot be matched. This is supremacy in its most persuasive form. Victory is expected soon. By now, the empire has veteran units, tested officers, frontiers and supply systems that can move men and material with frightening consistency. Its arsenals are full. Its fleets, if it has them, appear on distant coasts with disciplined regularity. Military machine now does more than fight. It deters. Rome could deploy legions with an efficiency that smaller rivals struggled to match. The Mongols combined speed, horse archery, intelligence, and terror into a system that shattered armies before many opponents understood what they were facing. Britain's navy made the sea, once a barrier, into an avenue of power. An empire at this peak benefits from more than bravery or numbers. It benefits from standards. Weapons are produced more uniformly. Officers are trained within a recognizable tradition. Engineers know how to raise camps, build bridges, breach walls, and maintain roads. This coherence matters because war punishes confusion. Armies break when orders arrive late, when supplies fail, or when commanders cannot adapt. A dominant empire usually avoids these weaknesses for a time, and that gives its forces the appearance of inevitability. There is also the psychological edge of reputation. Once a great power has won repeatedly, its enemies begin to fight not only the army in front of them, but the memory of its past victories. Some surrender early, some hesitate, some commit too late because they have already half accepted defeat. Military supremacy also shapes society at home. Veterans carry prestige. Children grow up with stories of campaigns that confirm the empire's greatness. The frontier becomes less a danger than a theater in which the state demonstrates its continued excellence. Yet even here at the summit, one fragile truth remains. military supremacy is never a permanent possession. It must be renewed through training, adaptation, recruitment, production, and discipline. No empire remains unbeatable simply because it once was. Weapons spread, tactics are copied, defeated peoples observe carefully. The challenger of tomorrow often studies beneath today's victories. But for now, the imperial center still believes in its durability. Standards rise above encampments calmly. Armor is polished. Horses are watered. Drums or horns mark the rhythm of a forest that seems perfectly ordered. This is the moment when power looks most complete, when the empire appears not merely capable of winning war, but naturally entitled to do so. And that very confidence begins quietly preparing the ground for the next transformation of the cycle. And yet, success changes the victor. The achievements that make an empire formidable begin, over time, to alter the habits that made it rise. One of history's quieter ironies appears here. Discipline creates abundance, and abundance can soften discipline. In the early phase of ascent, sacrifice feels normal, hardship is expected, and elites remain close enough to danger to understand the cost of failure. At the peak, life at the center is different. Wealth accumulates, ceremonies grow more elaborate, political office becomes more desirable, and sometimes less merit-based. Families born into security inherit institutions they never built, and scarcity fades. This does not mean greatness vanishes at once. Powerful empires can remain wealthy and militarily capable for long stretches, even as their inner character begins to shift. The change is gradual, almost invisible from within. Comfort rarely announces itself as weakness. It appears as refinement, confidence, entitlement, and the assumption that tomorrow will look much like today. Military service may become more professionalized and more distant from the broader population. That can improve efficiency for a time, but it can also loosen the bond between society and the army that protects it. Mercenaries, auxiliaries, colonial troops, or provincial recruits may take a larger share of the burden. Elites at the center still celebrate imperial power, but fewer expect to bleed for it. Administration can grow heavier. Offices multiply. Court politics deepen. Patronage competes with competence. A state that once rewarded grit may begin rewarding access. Titles, privileges, and inherited status start to matter more, while the restless energy that built the empire becomes harder to locate. This is dangerous because rival powers are watching. They do not see inevitability. They see habits, patterns, and vulnerabilities. They notice complacent commanders, overconfident diplomats, slower reforms, and the gap between imperial self-image and performance. Meanwhile, the costs of empire do not shrink simply because the center has grown comfortable. Roads need repair. Fleets require pay. Garrisons still demand food and discipline. This stage rarely feels dramatic in real time. There is no single evening when an empire suddenly becomes complacent. Instead, there are banquets, assumptions, delayed reforms, tolerated corruption, and 1,000 small decisions made by people who cannot imagine that the world beneath them is beginning to shift. That is why decline so often starts under conditions of apparent success. The banners still fly. The currency still circulates. The capital still gleams. But the tone has changed. What was once sharpened by necessity is now padded by habit. And as comfort settles into the bones of power, the empire begins to discover that strength, once inherited rather than earned, can look solid long after it has started to thin. Expansion had once felt like motion. Now power had to be maintained, and maintenance is the heavier labor. An empire at full stretch must defend mountain passes, patrol sea lanes, garrison distant cities, repair roads, watch governors, pay armies, and answer unrest in places the capital barely remembers. The map that once looked like proof of greatness begins at this stage to behave like an invoice. Every frontier fort needs food. Every fleet needs timber, sailcloth, iron, and wages. Every province must be watched closely enough to remain useful, yet not so harshly that rebellion becomes more expensive than loyalty. Conquest can be swift. Administration across distance is repetitive, costly, and often thankless. A ruler may win fame by taking a city, yet spend years holding the roads that lead to it. Large empires consume their own success. The more territory they command, the more they must spend merely to preserve what they already possess. Taxes rise. Borrowing expands. Coin may be clipped, diluted, or stretched by wishful policy. A treasury that once funded campaigns from surplus begins to rely on extraction. The military feels this burden first. Armies on multiple frontiers cannot all be elite at once. Some units are underpaid, some commanders are promoted for political reasons, and some outposts are left weaker than they appear on official reports. Supplies arrive late. Repairs are postponed. Men grumble, but the capital still speaks the language of strength. Sea power becomes expensive in ways inland courts often underestimate. Ships rot quietly when neglected. Harbors silt. Crews need training long before battle begins. A navy that was once decisive can decline slowly through budgets, complacency, and delays that never sound dangerous until a rival fleet appears. Empires also discover that time works differently at scale. Orders travel farther. Mistakes take longer to correct. A rebellion that would have been crushed quickly near the center may grow for months on a distant frontier before serious force arrives. In that delay, provincial leaders measure the empire's reaction time and learn whether fear of the center is still justified. None of this means collapse has begun. Many empires carry these burdens for generations. But the character of power changes here. Strength is no longer defined by how fast the state can expand, but by how efficiently it can absorb strain. It asks not for one brilliant campaign, but for endurance across 1,000 ordinary days. In quiet offices, scribes recalculate revenues. On muddy frontiers, soldiers patch boots and wait for pay. In shipyards, carpenters repair hulls that few poets will ever praise. This is the hidden season of empire, when greatness depends less on triumph than on sustaining a vast machine whose appetite never really sleeps. While the dominant empire struggles with maintenance, its rivals are studying. The center is occupied by governing what it already owns. The challenger at the edge is freer to watch, copy, and choose its moment. No empire keeps its advantages secret for long. Drill methods can be observed, ship designs can be imitated, tax systems, fortification styles, and command structures leave patterns behind. Defeat becomes a teacher. A humiliated state may spend decades learning exactly why it lost and what must be changed before the next encounter. Rome taught enemies the value of discipline. The Mongols taught settled kingdoms the cost of slow response. Naval powers taught one another how finance and logistics could multiply force. Over time, what once seemed unique becomes reproducible. Rising challengers often possess an important advantage beyond imitation. They are still hungry. Their elites are not yet dulled by abundance, and their officers are more often tested than inherited. Reform, which feels disruptive in a dominant empire, feels necessary in a rising one. Pain sharpens seriousness. These challenges also choose where to compete. They do not need to surpass the old empire everywhere at once. They can focus on a frontier, a weapon, a fleet, or a trade route. Sometimes the shift begins with artillery, sometimes with cavalry, sometimes with shipbuilding, and sometimes with credit and taxation. War favors states that can fund weapons longer. The old empire often mistakes this for imitation alone. It assumes that because others borrow its methods, they remain secondary. But copying is often the first stage of surpassing. Once a rival has learned the old forms, it can refine them, scale them, or combine them with new tools the complacent power was slow to adopt. Intelligence networks become more important here. Scouts, merchants, diplomats, and spies carry fragments of the future. They report that a rival army marches faster, that new cannon breach walls once thought safe, that a navy drills harder, that a frontier prince has united tribes once divided. Warning signs appear, but empires at their peak are least willing to reinterpret the world. And so two mentalities begin to face one another. The dominant power believes it is preserving order. The challenger believes it is correcting history. One defends position, the other reaches upward. On paper, the established empire may still look stronger. In spirit, the balance is already shifting. At night, young officers in rising states study campaigns once won by others. They trace roads, estimate supply lines, and imagine where the old giant will respond too slowly. In those quiet calculations, beneath the dignity of the old order, the next phase of the cycle is already being prepared. Empires often begin to weaken from within long before a foreign enemy delivers the decisive blow. The outward image remains impressive. Courts function, taxes arrive, armies march, and ceremonies continue. Yet cohesion begins to thin. Inequality is one of the oldest solvents of imperial stability. Wealth concentrates at the center or in the hands of families skilled at turning political access into private security. Provinces may remain productive, but feel exploited. Soldiers may serve, but sense that sacrifice and reward are no longer aligned. When enough people believe the empire serves only a narrow circle, loyalty becomes conditional. Corruption deepens the problem because it erodes trust in invisible ways. An official sells appointments. A governor inflates numbers. A contractor supplies poor grain or weak timber to the army while reporting full quality. No single act destroys the state, yet each one makes the machine less honest. On paper, the empire still appears strong. In practice, it has begun lying to itself. Succession can turn these weaknesses into open danger. Empires speak in the language of eternity, but leadership is always mortal. When a ruler dies without clear transition, ambition rushes in. Rival courts form. Generals hesitate. Provinces wait to see which faction will prevail. The enemy notices at once. Civil conflict is especially costly because it consumes the institutions meant to preserve order. Armies once raised against foreign threats are turned inward. Fortified cities resist their own sovereign. Treasuries are emptied to purchase alliances inside it. Each internal struggle teaches subjects that the center is no longer singular. Culture shifts as well. Founding virtues become slogans rather than habits. Duty is praised in speeches, while luxury and maneuvering shape real advancement. A younger generation inherits prestige, but not always the discipline that earned it. Over time, the empire begins to depend more on memory of greatness than on renewal. At the edges, provincial identities quietly strengthen. Local languages, loyalties, and grievances harden. Some regions still fear the center. Others begin to treat distance as opportunity. The empire remains large, but the emotional map has changed. Decline can be hard to detect from monuments alone. The stone still stands. The banners still fly. But inside ministries, garrisons, courts, and marketplaces, people are adjusting their expectations downward. They start hedging, hiding wealth, delaying commitments, or preparing for futures no longer anchored to the imperial center. Before empires fall in public, they often loosen in private. Trust withdraws first. And once a state can no longer rely on confidence within, every threat outside becomes heavier. The battlefield itself begins to change. A power built for one age of war often struggles when war becomes something else. Sometimes the change is technological. Bronze gives way to iron. Walls that once resisted ladders are broken by artillery. Horse archers dominate one century, then firearms alter the balance in another. Sail yields to steam, wooden hulls to steel, and cavalry prestige survives long after industrial firepower has made old charges tragic. Change is not only about weapons, it is also about organization. New styles of drill, staff planning, logistics, and communications can matter as much as any blade or cannon. A state that moves information faster and mobilizes reserves more efficiently may defeat an older empire still relying on inherited routines. This transition is painful because established powers are often invested in the old way of fighting. Their officers built careers within it. Their nobles or factions draw prestige from its traditions. Their treasuries have already funded fortresses, fleets, and institutions designed for yesterday's threats. Reform feels expensive, disruptive, and at times insulting. Yet history does not pause for wounded pride. The challenger suffers less from this burden. It can adopt what works with fewer sentimental attachments. It can buy foreign expertise, reorganize recruitment, and build around new military realities. It does not need to defend the honor of old victories. It needs only to win the next one. Empires in decline therefore often fight in a divided condition. Their soldiers may still be brave, their banners still famous, and their commanders still confident, yet the framework around them is old. They defend fortresses vulnerable to new guns. They launch fleets without grasping how radically naval power has shifted. They rely on professional corps too small for the scale of conflict rivals can now sustain. Even doctrine reveals the strain. The old empire expects the enemy to behave according to familiar patterns, to respect known frontiers, move at recognizable speed, and fight in established ways. But history's dangerous moments arrive when those assumptions fail. The enemy appears earlier, fires farther, maneuvers differently, or funds war more efficiently than the old order expected. Still, it is difficult to persuade a great power that its age is changing. Ceremonies of rank continue. Reports are written in reassuring language. A few defeats are explained away as accidents. But the pattern deepens. What looked temporary begins to reveal a structural lag between the empire and the world forming around it. On quiet training grounds and in smoke-filled foundries, the future gathers. By the time it reaches the battlefield, the old empire will discover that courage alone cannot defend a system that failed to adapt. Then comes the shock, not always the final defeat, but the kind of blow that changes how the empire is seen by itself, by its subjects, and by every rival beyond its borders. A fortress falls that was supposed to hold. A fleet is destroyed. A frontier army is encircled. A rebellion survives the punishment meant to end it. The myth of inevitability breaks. Such moments compress years of hidden weakness into one visible event. Rome experienced them on several frontiers. Spain endured naval humiliation. Imperial courts across history have awakened to the news that an army once thought unbeatable has been scattered in mud, snow, or surf. The names differ, but the feeling is consistent. A great power discovers that reputation can die faster than institutions. Major defeat is never merely military. It spreads through finance, morale, and politics. Credit becomes harder. Allies hesitate. Subjects begin to ask whether obedience is still the safest choice. Officers defend themselves in reports. Ministers search for scapegoats. The ruler promises renewal, but certainty no longer carries the same weight. For soldiers, the experience is intimate. The disciplined rhythm of the old army gives way to confusion. Orders fail to arrive. Reserves do not appear. A road is cut, a bridge lost, a flank broken. Men who had marched beneath banners linked to generations of victory now see those same standards falling into smoke and shouting. Memory changes in an afternoon. Sometimes the empire responds with genuine vigor. Reforms are launched, taxes are raised, new armies are built, factories, shipyards, and arsenals work late into the night. Great powers often survive their first catastrophic defeats, and some recover. But even recovery proves the point. The empire must now labor to restore confidence it once possessed almost for free. The most enduring wound is psychological. Before the defeat, the imperial center imagines itself as the natural organizer of the world. Afterward, it must argue for that role. What once seemed self-evident now requires persuasion, force, and narrative repair. Rivals sense the opening immediately. They grow bolder at sea, at court, on trade routes, and along frontiers. Neutral states become less deferential. Provinces begin to test the limits of disobedience. The empire still stands, often immense and dangerous, but its enemies no longer look at it with the same old caution. They have seen it bleed night after night in the capital. Lights burn later than before. Couriers arrive mud-stained and urgent. Clerks recalculate losses. Families listen for names from distant battlefields. In that altered silence, the empire understands something it had long postponed admitting. Greatness did not make it immune to history. It only delayed the hour when history would return. After a major defeat, empires often try to prove that their reach is still equal to their memory. They send more troops, fortify more frontiers, subsidize more allies, launch more campaigns, and insist that renewed effort will restore the old balance. Sometimes this works for a time. A battered power may still possess immense reserves of population, industry, tax base, or maritime access, and these advantages can delay collapse for decades. But the strain changes in character. Expansion had once produced confidence because each campaign enlarged the resources of the state. Now, war consumes more than it secures. An empire in overreach must defend territories that no longer pay for themselves, protect sea lanes that are increasingly contested, and suppress revolts in lands whose loyalty was never deep enough to survive prolonged weakness. The map remains large, but its edges become expensive. Distance grows heavier. Orders take longer to reach the frontier. Reinforcements arrive too late, or in numbers too small to decide the outcome. Generals request men, grain, coin, horses, cannon, ships, and replacements, while ministers discover that every answer creates some new shortage elsewhere. To hold one province, another is thinned. The empire still wins battles, sometimes brilliant ones, but those victories no longer settle the wider contest. A rebellious city is retaken, then rebels again. A naval squadron is defeated, while an enemy alliance forms elsewhere. A frontier offensive gains territory that cannot be administered without more troops than the treasury can afford. This is exhaustion, not theatrical collapse. The soldiers still drill, The officials still issue decrees, the ports still receive cargo, and the capital still presents itself as master of events. Yet, beneath that surface, the system is spending strength faster than it can renew it. Debt becomes one sign of the burden. Loans taken in emergency become normal policy. Taxes rise, but higher extraction often weakens the very provinces expected to sustain the center. Merchants hide wealth, landholders resist. Local elites begin asking whether imperial protection is still worth imperial cost. Overreach is not only geographic, it is moral and political as well. The state asks too much of too many people for too long. It expects loyalty from subjects it no longer serves convincingly, endurance from soldiers who feel forgotten, and confidence from creditors who can already see the imperial balance sheet darkening. At night, supply wagons creep toward distant garrisons under escort. Clerks in treasury chambers count obligations that seem always to multiply. Somewhere beyond the frontier, rivals wait patiently, knowing that time itself has become their ally. The empire is still vast, dangerous, still capable of astonishing force. But it is now carrying more empire than it can comfortably bear, and the weight is beginning to show. Decline rarely announces itself with one dramatic sound. More often it arrives as a change in tempo, a slowing of confidence, a thinning of response, a sense that the great machine still exists, but no longer moves with its former certainty. This is decline in slow motion. The imperial court still receives ambassadors. Coins still bear the ruler's image. Armies still march beneath long familiar standards. Yet the meaning of these things has shifted. They are no longer proof of undisputed command, but evidence of continuity that the empire now works hard to preserve. At the center, officials speak the language of renewal. They promise reforms, improved revenues, stronger frontiers, restored discipline. Some reforms are sincere and some even work. But each solution now operates inside a narrower world, where the empire has less margin for error than before. Provinces begin behaving differently. Once they looked to the capital for direction, prestige, and protection. Now they look inward. Governors become semi-independent in practice. Regional armies identify more with their commander than with the distant sovereign. Local merchants shift trade toward rising powers. Border populations learn to negotiate with both empire and rival. Decline is therefore not emptiness, but fragmentation. The empire still possesses institutions, yet those institutions no longer bind the whole with equal force. One province is orderly, another resentful, another nearly autonomous. A fleet remains impressive on paper, while its crews are undertrained. A frontier line exists on maps, while raids and smuggling quietly pass through it each season. Even memory changes. Older generations recall victories, expansion, and the confidence of imperial peak. Younger generations inherit only the ritual of greatness. They hear speeches about destiny, but see budgets cut, roads unrepaired, and authority negotiated instead of imposed. the difference between image and experience widens. This stage can last a surprisingly long time. Some empires drift in diminished form for centuries, too large to vanish quickly and too weakened to shape the world as they once did. That is why decline can feel strangely calm from within. Daily life continues. Markets open. Courts meet. Taxes are collected. The structure remains, but the center of gravity has moved. In quiet harbors, fewer imperial ships return than before. Along old military roads, milestones stand weathered beside thinner columns of men. In provincial mansions and border camps alike, people begin planning their future with less reference to the capital. That is how great powers become ceremonial versions of themselves. They do not disappear first in stone. They disappear first in expectation. When enough people stop believing that the empire can still decide the fate of the wider world, decline has already advanced far beyond what official language is willing to admit. No empire rules the world forever. At some point, trade routes begin to favor another coast. Military innovation gathers in another workshop. Credit becomes cheaper in another capital, and ambition burns brighter under another flag. Power transfers long before monuments fall. The first sign is not always conquest, but comparison. Merchants discover that another navy offers safer passage. Diplomats notice that treaties now depend on a different court. Bankers price risk according to a new center of strength. Generals study the methods of a rival power because those methods now seem fresher, faster, or harder to resist. This is how a new order emerges. The old empire may still possess territory, prestige, and enormous reserves, but the future is no longer organizing itself around its priorities. One by one, the habits of the world adjust. A reserve currency weakens as confidence drifts elsewhere. Colonies, provinces, or client states test looser bonds. Alliances that once formed to appease the empire now form to hedge against it. The great power that defined the rules becomes one participant among others, then one important participant, and finally, a memory that still has armed force but no longer commands the age. Sometimes the transfer is violent. A decisive war, revolution, or invasion may expose how completely the balance has changed. Sometimes it is quieter. The old empire remains in place, but its industries slow, its fleets thin, its borrowing grows harder, and its brightest minds move toward the new center. The banners stay aloft, while the current beneath them flows elsewhere. History offers many versions of this passage. Mediterranean orders yielded to others. Land empires gave way to maritime ones. Maritime empires, in time, encountered industrial rivals whose productive scale altered everything. The names differ, but the structure returns. The rising power is younger in confidence, more adaptive, more willing to suffer for ascent. The old empire is richer in memory, but more burdened by commitments, habits, and self-regard. For those living through the transfer, the shift can be disorienting. The old language of greatness still fills ceremonies and school books, Yet the wider world is already orienting to a different pole. Maps have not fully changed, but the invisible map of power has. In ports, merchants count which flag now secures the seas. In war colleges, officers translate foreign manuals. In ministries, officials deny decline while drafting policies shaped by realities they can no longer ignore. And so the old empire enters a strange twilight. It still exists, still negotiates, still punishes, still remembers. But the age is no longer its own. The world has begun, quietly and without permission, to turn toward someone else. When we step back from individual empires, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. The names change, the religions change, the weapons change, and the banners change, yet the larger rhythm keeps returning. Rise, expansion, wealth, confidence, strain, fragmentation, and transfer. Rome followed one version of it. So did Imperial Spain, the Ottoman world, Britain, and many others in forms shaped by their own geography and era. Some rose through cavalry and land discipline. Some rose through ocean routes, finance, and industrial production. Some expanded by absorbing neighbors slowly. Others through sudden conquest. Yet beneath those differences lay recurring foundations. Strong education or training, social cohesion, productive capacity, military competence, reliable revenue, a governing class still close enough to danger to take survival seriously. Then came the familiar transformation. Success generated abundance. Abundance widened inequality and softened urgency. Rivals learned. Debt accumulated. Internal conflict sharpened. The cost of maintaining primacy rose faster than the ability to pay for it. This was one of Ray Dalio's central observations, though history saw the pattern long before it received modern language. Great powers often move through long cycles in which financial strength, military strength, reserve currency status, internal order, and educational vigor reinforce one another during ascent, then erode together during decline. No single factor explains everything. Empires do not fall because of one battle alone, or one ruler, or one debt crisis. They fall when too many supporting systems weaken at once. The battlefield then reveals decay that had already spread through finance, politics, administration, and belief. That is why decline so often surprises those living inside it. They focus on the latest war or latest crisis, while the deeper cycle has been unfolding beneath them for generations. They notice the smoke, not the dry timber. This pattern does not make history mechanical. Human decisions still matter. Brilliant leaders can delay decline. Foolish ones can hasten it. New technology can rescue one state and undermine another. Geography never stops shaping the pace. Still, the rhyme remains. The empire that rises is usually disciplined, adaptive, and somewhat austere. The empire that peaks believes its position reflects superior order. The empire that declines spends more energy preserving status than renewing the foundations that created it. Across deserts, seas, forests, and industrial cities, the sequence returns with patient regularity. It is not fate exactly, but it is one of history's most persistent habits. And because it returns so often, the study of old empires becomes more than memory. It becomes a mirror, held quietly before every great power that assumes its own age will be the exception. In the end, the lesson of empires is not only that they fall, it is that they rise through human choices that seem solid while they are being made, and fall through human choices that often seemed manageable at the time. No empire plans its own decline. Each tells itself a story of continuity. Its armies are still brave. Its capital is still splendid. Its laws still function. Its currency still circulates. Its leaders still speak in the language of destiny, stability, and renewal. Yet history is not moved by confidence alone. It is moved by discipline, maintained or neglected, by debts honored or stretched, by institutions renewed or hollowed out, by whether a society can still ask sacrifice of itself and believe in the answer. Empires rise when people organize effectively around food, force, ideas, revenue, and belief. They expand when victory brings wealth, and wealth strengthens victory. They endure when administration, law, and logistics turn conquest into structure. They weaken when comfort replaces urgency, when factions multiply, when corruption thickens, and when rivals study more seriously than the old giant is willing to adapt. Then comes the familiar sorrow. The empire still speaks as though it commands the age, while the age has already begun moving beyond it. Its provinces grow distant in feeling before they grow distant on maps. Its victories cost more than they secure. Its symbols remain bright even as its foundations dim. And finally, whether in one violent century or over many quieter generations, the center yields its place. Still, there is something almost tender in this pattern. For all their iron banners and battlefields, empires prove to be temporary arrangements of human effort. They are vast, but not permanent, fearsome, but not immune, magnificent, but not exempt from time. The frontier fires go out, roads crack, harbors change hands, coins are buried, found, and studied by strangers. The names of rulers once spoken with trembling certainty become lines in books, then fragments in memory, then echoes beneath the larger silence of history. And perhaps that is why the rise and fall of empires remains so compelling. It reminds us that power is real, but never final, that triumph can harden into complacency, that decline can begin inside success, and that no order, however mighty, is granted forever. History leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves behind patterns, warnings, and a strange humility for anyone willing to notice how often strength mistakes itself for permanence. Tonight, as the world grows quieter around you, let the old capitals recede into darkness. Let the drums fade, the standards lower, the fleets drift into mist, and the frontier fires burn low beneath a wide and indifferent sky. The world slows, and so do we. Good night.